Welcome back to the Alcohol Tipping Point. I am your host, Debbie Maisner, and today we have a lovely guest from across the pond. She goes by PI for Person Irresponsible, and she'll tell us a little bit more about that name. But I'm super excited to have her on here because she reached out to me, has written a book, has done like a fabulous adventure that we're going to hear all about today. And also hear about her experience with alcohol. So welcome, PI.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Debbie. It's great to be here.
So you are calling from England, you mentioned.
I am, yes. And it's a dry day, but it's pretty chilly now. Winter is arriving.
Wonderful. So tell us about your name. I guess, first of all, we should get that out of the way because people will be like, Person Irresponsible. Why do you call yourself that?
Oh, it's interesting. PI or Person Irresponsible. And the Americans always hear it as personally responsible, as if I am to blame for everything in the world. And I have to correct them on that. I'm just responsible for my part. And I'm largely, not renowned for making very sensible decisions. And so PI or Person Irresponsible is the name that I wrote my book under. And the reason I maintain that is, one, it was my trail name. And a trail name is something given to thru hikers or something thru hikers use. I don't know why. It's just part of the culture of it. And I, in 2020, walked across America. So I am now a fully fledged thru hiker. But the reason for maintaining anonymity is because I am a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the traditions are very clear that at the level of press, radio, and film, we should remain anonymous. And so to comply with that, it's easier to just use my thru hiking name. And I was previously known as PI anyway, that if anybody ever wanted to complain about anything I wrote or did, they could write to Person Irresponsible and not really expect a sensible response.
And I love that. And I think it's fun. It makes you unique.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, you reached out to me because you had quite an experience last year with hiking across America, like you said. But I wonder if we want to start back at the beginning of your relationship with alcohol.
Absolutely. I mean, when I decided to walk across America, I was as sober as a person could be. I hadn't had a drink at that point for over 3 years. I was in my 4th year of recovery. And I went the AA route simply because I didn't know about anything else. But it's worked for me, and I stick with it because it's just, sobriety is so precious and it's so fragile that it's not worth experimenting with. And so that's the route I went. That's how I got sober, and that's how I remain sober. So my journey with alcohol begins really, really, really young. I grew up in a high drinking household, and they had this belief, this parenting philosophy, that if you give kids alcohol, it totally demystifies it for them, and they won't grow up to be alcoholic. So as parenting philosophies go, I'm probably not in support of it, because I'm kind of the rule that, or the exception that proves the rule possibly, or just proves it as a poor philosophy. But it did kind of work, because in my teenage years, although I drank, I wasn't as obsessed with it as perhaps some of my peers were, because it just wasn't, it wasn't this sort of mythical adult liquid that I was fascinated by. I'd always been around it, so I was a bit sort of indifferent to it. Happy to drink, happy to not drink, really. But it all kind of, I found the real potent effects of alcohol in my early 20s, when I could shut my door on a Friday night and tuck myself in and have a nice glass of wine. And that nice glass of wine was actually one bottle of wine. And I used to love it. I didn't necessarily drink every day. I didn't get hangovers particularly. And then it became Friday and Saturday. And then, sometimes it was quite nice to drink a bit more than a bottle of wine. And sometimes what I noticed was, when I finished the wine, I was casting around for more, and I didn't have any more, and I think some of the things that keep alcohol contained for women and for me particularly is, in my early 20s I didn't have a right lot of money, so it wasn't that easy to go out and get drunk all the time. But obviously drinking at home is significantly cheaper. But I also found I didn't have those pressures of being around other people and having to watch what I drank. I could just chill out, relax. And I've since come to learn that if I'm controlling my drinking, I'm not enjoying it. And if I'm enjoying my drinking, I'm not controlling it. And that's really the story of my drinking. So there are certain events where I can see now that it was accelerating. I got married in my mid-20s to a heavy drinking man. And I hid behind that. He drank, so I drank. And then I drank, so he drank. And we traveled the world together and we spent a lot of time in bars together. So I didn't do the tourist thing. I just got drunk. I didn't know I was alcoholic. I wouldn't have ever called myself an alcoholic because, lots of people drink to excess. So if you're looking for those kind of people, you're going to find them, like attracts like. And so it was only really when I got to, when my marriage broke down in my very late 30s and I just turned to booze, and it was a major accelerant. So I'd gone from drinking heavily to just wanting to be drunk all the time to deal with the heartbreak and the hurt and the anger and the disappointment and all of that. So when I finally walked into my first AA meeting, I was a sort of emotional wreck. I wasn't drinking around the clock. I never drank in the mornings. I didn't drink before 6 o'clock because that would make you an alcoholic. I didn't necessarily drink 7 days a week. In fact, some weeks I had to work 5 days and therefore I could only drink 2. And I found that outrageous. But I just knew I could stop, but I couldn't stay stopped. And I really wanted a break from the stuff. But no matter what, I kept going and getting more wine. So I'd chalk up a few days and then, I don't know, something would happen. The cat would meow, most probably. 9 times out of 10, I had to find the bloody cat to get it to meow, and then I could justify the drink. So it was just, the whole thing became really obsessional. It became the center point of my life, and it happened slowly. And I live in a country where we do worship booze. And I say that knowing that 4 out of 5 people in the UK don't or barely drink. But the 1/5 of us drink for the rest of the population, and I've certainly drank my lifetime's allowance and several of my neighbours, so that's them deprived for a while. And we really glorify it and we make it seem so sophisticated. And yet now I'm sober, I have yet to meet a sophisticated drunk. We're just not that great. And so, it was a struggle to get sober in the sense of I didn't necessarily, the cat has just joined us, by the way. So if you hear me out, I have got coffee and that's what you'll hear me drinking. But I've sort of come to learn that, that I have this obsession with booze that not everybody else has. And I sort of come to learn actually life is so much better without drinking it. There's so much more you can do. And that doesn't include walking across America. It's not a compulsory part of sobriety, but it was fun.
So for you, you grew up kind of in a interesting family situation where your parents decided just to kind of make drinking a non-issue and be okay for kids. And it wasn't till later in your life, and especially after your divorce, that it really became a problem. And then
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was always, looking back, it was always a problem, but the amount that I drank changed over time. I always drank to excess. I loved drinking. I loved the party life. I loved drinking at home, especially because I didn't have to worry so much about consequences. But I also, there was this heavy drinking culture in my family background as well. So it was normalized. It was only when I got into recovery and sobriety that I learned that the maximum women should drink is 1 bottle of wine a week. And it's like, well, what's the bloody point? There's no point in drinking 1 bottle of wine a week. That's nothing. That came as complete revelation to me, that, some people out there really do drink that and that's all they ever need. That wouldn't have done a night for me, really.
Sure, same. It's kind of like decaf coffee too. Like, what's the point?
That said, I like decaf coffee, but it just proves that I'm a bit strange.
Okay. So for you, what was most helpful to be alcohol free was AA.
to be honest, it was one of those things that I didn't know of anything else. And what in the UK, to go and get help, most people will go to their GP, their doctor. But there is stigma involved in having a drinking problem. It's not considered a disease in this country or an illness. It's considered a willpower problem, and therefore you're just being a bit pathetic if you can't manage your drink. And that seems to be quite a common perception. And if you go to your doctor, of course, you then have to have it on your medical records. Well, that can have long-term consequences on your career. And I was quite career-minded for much of my life. So I certainly didn't want anything on my doctor's records to say that I drank. There's other repercussions that if you're having problems with alcohol, you may have your license taken away from you, your driving license. Well, that can have a huge impact on your career. If you have children, they can let social services know. So when you suddenly start to think, when I don't know about other people, but I was very sensitive and very paranoid when I first, started to realize I had a drink problem. I didn't want anybody to know. It was my filthiest secret, and I was so ashamed of it. So when I sort of was coming up with the options, it was all a bit of a series of happenstances in a way that I came across AA. I had some vague notion of it, but I didn't really know what it was. And all I wanted was a break. I didn't want to stop drinking forever. I just wanted a break. And in my logic, I just thought, well, those alcoholics, if they can do it, they'll be able to show me how to do it. And all I want to do is 28 days of not drinking. Then I can sort my life out, and then I'll carry on drinking again. The plan went wrong because I went to AA and they really put me off drinking, so, for which I'm eternally grateful. At the time, not so pleased, but now very, very grateful. And so it was, I didn't know of anything else. And I was living in Scotland when I sort of decided to give up the booze or stop drinking the amount I was drinking. And they were rolling out an alternative called Smart Recovery, which is a government-funded program. Which is doing really well. It's taken off, and they claim that they can teach you to control your drinking. I've never controlled my drinking. I've never wanted to control my drinking, so I'm not sure it would have worked for me, but it certainly works for some people. So I'm not here to diss that at all. And there are other alcohol recovery services around, but I knew nothing of that at that time. So it was when I placed the phone call to AA and I found out I didn't have to give my name. I never had to fill in a form. I could just sit in the back of a meeting and never be there, officially, that it became very appealing, because I thought, well, these professional drinkers will show an amateur like me how to sort of abstain for 28 days.
Okay. That makes perfect sense. And just like you said, having that stigma and the barrier to seeking care with those consequences on your medical record and whatnot, it did make AA more appealing for you, and feeling like you didn't have much of a choice. So, and it stuck.
It stuck, and it's the best thing I've ever done. And I think, like a lot of people, you walk in, a lot of the meetings are in church basements and or chapels or so on. So we automatically, as a sermon, it's connected to that church, which is it's faulty thinking, because it's not. I've since learned it's because the rent's really bloody cheap. And if we all wanted to give lots more in terms of donations, we could have it in the Hilton, but we don't. So we keep it cheap. And also alcoholics generally aren't necessarily got that much money going around in some instances. So one, don't let the locations put you off. And secondly, it's famous for the 12 steps, and the 12 steps uses the God word. And I think in America, attitudes to religion are slightly different than they're here in the UK. It can really freak us out. We see the God word, and the second word you'll think is cult. Therefore, the minute you walk into AA, you think, oh my goodness, this is a cult, and I'm terrified. I'm going to be abducted and given to aliens and, sacrificed and all of this. So again, it can be quite off-putting, but I actually, there was quite a lot of religion in my more extended family. So and I traveled the world. So I was I could sort of protect myself from feeling like, oh my goodness, I've joined this religious sect. But, over time, I've had to change my attitude considerably. And whilst I still don't class myself as religious, I have truly adopted the spiritual way of life. And I'm so much the happier for doing so.
Well, let's get to where you decided to have this adventure of hiking through America.
Well, that again, I can blame AA for that madness. Like I say, they really changed my life. It's a fellowship, and so you end up meeting like-minded people. And I'm a woman. I'm now in my early 40s, or when I joined AA, I was in my early 40s. Alas, no longer. And so a lot of my peers were coming at the same time. So I made all these great friends very quickly who were also in the early sobriety, and we went on this sort of journey together. And actually, my circle of friends, I'm the only one that's still sober. Another one died sober, but I'm the only one that's still sober. So it shows you how devastating this disease is. Mm-hmm. And it was her that had watched this film called Wild. This friend of mine that died had watched this film called Wild. And she was really taken with it. And she kept banging on like, you've got to watch this. You've got to watch this. And that's like, really, I don't. It's not my cup of tea. And the standing joke between us is if she loved a film or a book, guaranteed I'd hate it, and vice versa. So when she's raving on about this thing, I was just like, listen, love, it's not going to happen. Stop it. And she carried on. So I said, fine, I'll cook you dinner. And so long story short, I watched it with her. And then she's go and read the book. So I was like, oh, flipping heck. And at the time, I was doing these series of challenges where people suggested I did something. If they were happy to pay for whatever, I'd go and do it no matter what. So she bought me the book and said, go read this book. And so I read this book, watched the film, and it just gripped me. So then I ended up reading 6 more books on what's called the PCT, or the Pacific Crest Trail. And I was fascinated with it. It never occurred to me people can walk the entire length of America from north to south. I had no idea. This is the world's longest trail. And again, I just kept thinking, well, it'd be really nice to go for quite a long walk, actually. Therapists always say if you've got a lot on your mind, go for a walk. And, it helps clear your mind. And I was like, well, I have a lot on my mind. Maybe I need a particularly long walk. And it was just, so I was reading all these books. And again, how sort of social media works now with cookies and all that sort of stuff. I got in the bath one day and I was sort of going up onto YouTube to look for something to listen to, like a podcast. And I really enjoy podcasts about alcohol and alcoholism. And people's stories, and we tend to be brutally honest, and lots of us have a great sense of humor, so they make for great podcasts. And on this sidebar, it just came up how to apply for a PCT license. I was like, blimey, I didn't even know you needed a license. No one mentioned it. And then I clicked on it, and I Googled about this license, and I found out it was that very day, and there was only one day that year you could apply for a permit. So I just jumped out of the bath, rushed upstairs, naked, very fat, wobbly, not a pretty picture, sat at my computer and completed all these different courses you had to do. One was about campfires. I mean, I could barely light a log burner, and the other one was like leave no trace, and it was all the principles of how to take care of the wilderness. And then I applied for this permit, and at the time about for every 4 people that applied, 1 was successful. So it wasn't a guarantee, and I got one on a reasonable date as well. And it was like, blimey, I'm going to go do this. And I think at that point I was like, God, this is terrifying, and just completely refused to think about it. And I don't walk. I'm not an outdoor, I was fat. I was early 40s. I was female. I was, as we would say, fucked, but it felt like I should really do this. And I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I'd be physically capable of doing it. Me and exercise. I wish I'd become addicted to exercise. It would have been such a better story. But I don't. I'm a sofa surfer, and I love living on my sofa. And so I had no idea really why I thought I should do this or could do this. I'd done other things. I'd always lived quite an exciting life, but everything I'd ever done had been motorized. That's the best way of doing anything. So the idea of powering myself across the country on 2 feet was terrifying. And then, of course, you have a whole host of wildlife out there that we only see in zoos or on TV. And I just tried my best not to think about those things too. So, yeah, there was a lot of denial and serendipity involved.
Wow. But meant to be. So if you haven't listened to, or you haven't watched Wild or read the book, can you give a brief overview of what it is about and what exactly is the Pacific Crest Trail?
Absolutely. So Wild is a film about a young woman who was in her early 20s, whose mother had died 4 years prior. And she'd never really got over it. She took a lot of heroin and other drugs and substances. And so she decided, and her marriage had broken down. So, she was, as we would say, an emotional basket case at this moment of her life. And so she decided to go for a long walk along the Pacific Crest Trail. Now, the actual trail itself is 2,653 miles. And she walked about 1,000 miles of it. And she skipped past some of the really ropey bits, the really sketchy bits. But at the end of it, she finds redemption, she finds peace, and I'm so sorry about the cat contributing to this conversation. You're going to hear him. You can see why he drove me to drink, honestly. And so, but anyway, she goes off on her own, and this is in the 90s, and walks alone with old-fashioned maps, and she was, not particularly an experienced hiker, and she did this on her own, and she wrote a book, and it became a bestseller, and then they made a film with Reese Witherspoon, and since then, it's captured lots of people's imagination. I really salute her, because doing that sort of stuff in the 90s, with there wasn't any technology, and I think things were slightly more dangerous for women on their own in those times. I'm not saying they're safe now, but I think in those times particularly, it would have been hard. And I figured, I'm at the time I was 40. How old was I? 45. And I figured, well, if she needed 1,000 miles, I'm twice her age. I'm going to probably have to use all of the distance. So, like I say, officially it's the world's longest trail because it's continuous. It goes from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, uninterrupted. Obviously, there's a few things like wildfires that might get you to detour. There was a rock slide. Occasionally you can't actually stay on the original trail. There's some endangered frogs at one part, so you have to reroute around those. But by and large, it's a continuous trail, and it's officially the world's longest. So it's quite an effort. And it's what I didn't know. Most people call it, and indeed I made this mistake, very embarrassing. It's not called the Pacific Coast Trail because it's nowhere near the sea. It's hundreds of miles inland where you have bears and rattlesnakes and all sorts of other hideous things. And high mountains, and it's all along the crest of these mountains. So you go through the Sierra Range, and then you go through the Cascade Range.
This is so amazing. So you were not a hiker, nope. And you just on a whim applied for this permit. You had your dates. So yeah, what was it like? When did you go?
Well, it was brilliant for the first minute. And then reality set in that I many years ago, in my early 20s, my now ex-husband had said, had taken me camping. I think we'd gone to like a Formula One race, and we were staying in a tent. I'd woken up the next day, and I looked at him and I said, if you ever put me in a tent again, I will divorce you. So me and camping, I consider camping a completely loathsome pursuit. I could not have been more ill prepared for this, except for possibly Cheryl Strayed, who was the protagonist in Wild. And so I bought this cheap tent, which was totally unsuitable. So I had to replace that quite quickly. Everybody goes on about lightweight this and lightweight that. I'd gone for bargain everything. And of course, it's not great equipment for long distance hiking. So within the first mile, I was confused as to why it had taken me nearly 40 minutes to walk a mile. Whereas in the UK, I could do a mile in 20 minutes. And I know because I timed myself, And of course, what I hadn't factored in was a whole load of things. One, when I walk in the UK, I'm at 400 feet above sea level. Now I'm at 4,000 feet, heading towards 12,000 feet above sea level, or 13,000 feet. Two, this country is largely flat by comparison. Yours goes up and down and up and down, and it's terrible. Three, when I did my mile in 20 minutes, I didn't have a rucksack on with a week's worth of food, with tent and sleeping equipment and cooking equipment and safety equipment and first aid kit. So all of these things had a huge impact on how quickly I could walk. So I got to the first mile marker, and I was like, blimey, American miles are really far. They're a lot bigger than British miles. Of course, there's no difference, but that was just the way my mind worked. So I knew straight away I was in a world of trouble. I really was going to be in a world of trouble. But the one thing I have learned about myself is I have, because I'm an alcoholic and because I've had enough hangovers in my lifetime, I have enormous amounts of fortitude. If you think about hangovers, they really, everything was hard work with a hangover. When I was actively drinking, doing the housework was hard, getting up for work was hard, doing any kind of extracurricular activities were hard. Everything was tremendously difficult. And since I've stopped drinking, it's amazing how much easier cooking and cleaning and going to work is and looking after animals and being friendly. And so, it was like what it had developed in me was enormous levels of fortitude. So I could cope with the pain and I could almost cope with the fear in a way, because I didn't know until I'd got in recovery that I've always been quite an anxious person. Because I used to mask it so well, and I used to keep it very hidden. Well, I thought I kept it hidden. Of course, obviously, I now know I didn't, because I drank a lot. So in some ways, I was made for this trip because I was used to living in fear and I'm used to hardship. But this was a whole different level of hardship. And like I say, the first day, it was a real leveler of my pride, because I think Cheryl Strayed had done 6 miles in the book, and in the film they make a point, and I'd been really scornful, like 6 miles, how ridiculous is that? And so, my first day's walking, I very quickly realized if I can make it to 7 miles, I'm going to be thrilled. And I'm not going to think about the remaining 2,640 something to go.
So you did the full trail. You started where and ended where?
I started in Mexico. Well, I started at the Mexican border. At the time, they hadn't built the wall there, so it was just this really flimsy metal fence. I was like, really? I'll go through half of that? So I started there at the controversial wall and literally just turned around and faced north and went, I'm walking that way. But of course, the trail itself, it doesn't just go in a straight line northward. It goes east and west and sometimes very bafflingly south for quite some time. And so I did the desert, which was about 700 miles. And the desert was, there was a lot of snow in the desert, which completely confused me. And then I hit the Sierra Mountains, and they say with the Sierras to go in mid-June at the earliest, because that's when conditions are at their best. But when, like me, you're a foreigner, you're time-bound by a 6-month visa. And they've changed the rules. Controversially, the PCTA, the association that sort of organizes these permits, has changed the rules so that you can't skip past the Sierra and come back and do it when the conditions are better. You've got to do a continuous line now through that section. You can't move around it. And so that encourages or forces everybody to go in when the snow conditions are still pretty harsh. And so it brings in the risk of avalanches and falling through snow crevasses and all sorts of other things. So I don't personally think it's a great rule, particularly for us older, weaker people. But so I did get through that. I did the big mountain Forester, and then I skipped 2. I sort of came out and came around them and then carried on through the rest of the Sierra, just because I was just not skilled for those kind of really highly specialized areas. And then you go into Northern California, which is very barren. And then, Oregon, which I loved because it was just trees everywhere. Mm-hmm. And then Washington, which again, more trees, but very high mountains. And so the whole sort of thing you can sort of divide into 5 sections. And so it kind of breaks up the thing. But I mean, California went on forever. California was, 4 months or just over 4 months of the walking was in California. So very long state, that one.
And you were doing it last year during the pandemic.
In the pandemic, yes, which was again controversial. It was difficult to decide what to do for the best. And I know lots and lots of people. Obviously, the wilderness was empty. Not everybody, the vast majority had gone back to their place of origin. But I lived in a rental in the UK, so I put everything in storage, and the UK went into a really severe lockdown. So there was nowhere, in some respects, nowhere for me to go. And I'm sure somewhere would have given me a back bedroom if I'd asked, but I didn't. And I honestly was really optimistic about this pandemic, that it's all going to be over by the end of the summer, And the people we met on the trail, they were lovely. Everybody was sort of it's all a bit bewildering. And it was really baffling to begin with, we live in a hike-filled world, and I think when you live in a very sensationalist 24-hour-a-day news sort of existence, everything becomes a long drama. So it's very hard to sometimes ascertain when something's hype and something's actually something quite scary. And the way I figured was, well, if there's this, deathly virus going around, I'm better off in the wilderness than I am moving around towns anyway. But social media was quite brutal. They weren't, it wasn't a very nice read on social media. But on the whole, I had absolutely no problem, wore the masks and took sensible precautions.
Oh, yeah. I just think it's so fabulous that you did this at such a...
The big benefit and disadvantage was it made it very, very lonely because there was just no one else out there for months at a time. And, the longest I went without speaking to another human being or any indication that there'd been another human being on planet Earth was 4.5 days. There was no planes in the sky or anything. So, yeah, and that was the best and the worst of it, because sometimes you want to be social and you do want other hikers around. But I spent about 70% of my nights sleeping alone overall. So it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. And like I say, I don't really regret doing it because it felt like old school long distance hiking.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you wrote a book about it called Everything You Ever Taught Me.
Yes, because one of the things, it's being an alcoholic, the thing I've learned so much about myself, and I've learned so much in AA. I went to AA thinking it was all about not drinking. Actually, it's my thinking that leads to my drinking. So it's all about what can you do to change your thinking. And so, the 12 steps are a really great way of learning to manage, all your emotions, from being too excitable and too optimistic through to too much guilt, too much shame, too much self-loathing. And so it's a real place of change. And it taught me so many life skills that I hadn't acquired, partly through growing up in very dysfunctional circumstances, probably, oh goodness me, he's back. And so I learned so much about how to break the day down, right into early recovery, that it's so hard to think about never drinking again. It's impossible. And I can't say to you, I'm never going to drink again. It's too big. But I can say to you, I'm not going to drink today. I'm going to do whatever it takes to not drink today. So breaking everything down into really small things, and then becoming much more compassionate. And I still have to work on this. I have these terribly perfectionist tendencies that I want to do everything perfectly and brilliantly and be top of the class, even when I'm not in a class, And so, having to learn to sort of cope with that constant fear of, am I going to be eaten alive by a bear? Well, no, you're not in bear country right now, so it's fine, but the rattlesnakes will get you, so having to deal with fear and anxiety, and the fact that it teaches, the trail teaches you just to take each day as it comes, literally, and you don't know what's going to happen that day. You can have expectations, but you're probably going to be wrong. And I think that's what AA taught me. So I ended up writing a book called Everything You Ever Taught Me, because I had this epic journey of fear and loneliness and hunger like you wouldn't believe. I was permanently starving by the end, and sheer exhaustion, tiredness. But I also had a head full of lots of bad memories and lots of anxiety and lots of anger, and that head goes with you when you walk. So it was all about how to manage that kind of extreme adventure with a head like mine that just constantly says you're not good enough and you shouldn't be here, and you're rubbish at this, and yet despite that carrying on. So the book was, and along the way obviously you meet people, and something I hadn't expected was how much drug taking there is within the through hiking community. And although drugs aren't a big part of my story, they are certainly very tempting when you're very vulnerable. And watching how that, drugs affected other people, particularly like you have cannabis that's legal in the States, it's not legal here, but it's been changed and redesigned into almost sweets and sherbets and all sorts of other really fanciful things that the wrapping's really childish, so it looks really enticing and fun and exciting, but it still has an adverse effect on some people. Not everybody. Like alcohol, it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. So it was really interesting watching some people really succumb to their, dare I say, addiction, because they couldn't see that their need to have drugs all the time was affecting their behavior. So whereas once you're sober, you can see how addiction and alcohol abuse nibbles at your quality of life, but it does it so subtly that you don't see it shrinking. So I found myself walking with drug users and all of that, and I found myself getting frustrated because I had a different goal to them, and then all the conflict of dealing with other hikers, and so I talk about how I maintained sobriety through that trip through the 12 steps, but also how I ultimately, despite all the odds, I mean, you would not place money on me finishing this. I did it, and I had quite an epic journey, and all my fears came true. I encountered everything that I was scared of and dealt with it.
So what does your title mean? Everything you ever taught me. Who is that referring to?
The you can be pretty much anything. I go back. I don't particularly write about my drinking because I always think, well, most people know how to drink, So I just explain, for anyone that's not a drinker, I just explain how I came to the conclusion that I was alcoholic, which is one is never enough, nor is 1,000, And so I don't really go into great drinking stories, but I do go, I took a head. My head divides itself into two things. It's either ruminating about the past and reminding me of either mistakes I've made or mistakes other people have made, and it's constantly trying to take me down a bad memory lane, or it's living in fantasy land. I'm never quite in the present. I'm never quite here. And so it's, so sometimes I do talk about those life experiences I had that really shaped me, and how the trail itself was unlearning that for me, and how the skills and lessons that I learned in AA were re-showing me that actually sometimes my thinking is just so corrupted that I've really got to change how I think. And so it's just how to navigate a world, that sometimes I struggle to relate to. And I think it's so common amongst people who abuse alcohol. We always feel we're a bit unique, special and different, and we always feel a little bit apart from. I think that's such a common theme with people who have abused drink or drugs. And so it's how once you've spent decades, in my case, using alcohol to try and suppress my emotions and to try and hide behind it, when you're suddenly out there in the real world, you're raw, and it can be, like I say, it's a huge. Growing up is really painful, and when you're suddenly in your early 40s and all your peers have grown up and you've just drunk and partied for 20 years, you have to do a lot of growing up in a really short space of time. So the book sort of really charts what through hiking is like, which is grim. It's disgusting. I mean, you stink. You don't take deodorant. It's foul. But it's also learning a lot about how you can manage your own head and how you can reprocess a lot of your old bad memories and things.
Well, what would you say are some of your tips for anyone looking to change their relationship with alcohol or make a big change? There's some parallels between the thing
that saved me was learning that I have never given up the booze, because I haven't given up something that's trying to kill me. I've set myself free from it. So I no longer think of myself as being deprived of alcohol. I feel truly liberated, because it had taken over, and it took over so subtly. So you're never giving up the booze. It's just making a decision. I'm not going to drink today. And then the next part is I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure I don't drink today. So some people are always like, you still go to meetings? And it's like, yeah, I probably will, for the rest of my life. They're social affairs, and there's a lot of fellowship there. I've made friends through that. We have a great social life. I'm always active and busy, and I just don't, and it doesn't revolve around drink anymore. So I find it easier now that I'm nearly 50 to make friends than I've ever found it in my life, because I'm surrounded by people who also don't drink and enjoy life without drink involved. So I'd say that first and foremost is if you're like me, that alcohol is an emotional crutch, it's reminding yourself that it's actually just a toxin. And when you're drinking alcohol, all you're drinking is liquid anxiety. It's like a payday loan. You take it in, it gives you temporary reprieve, but the next day you've got to pay it back with interest. So your anxiety shoots up. And then, of course, that sets you up for needing more booze. So that top tip is learning, and I used to hate this part of AA, is when people go, this too shall pass. And it's like, when I'm having a bad emotion, my brain says this too shall stay. And, so feelings they're little wild animals, and they need to be trained. That actually, it's okay to have feelings. I never believed it was okay to have feelings. I actually genuinely thought I should be a automaton, because life would be so much easier if I didn't have feelings. Whereas now I'm a human being, I have feelings galore, and I'm learning to how to cope with them and sit with them and be with them. And I no longer have to reach for that bottle, and it's as simple as, when I was happy, alcohol would make me ecstatic. If I was sad, alcohol would anesthetize me. If I was angry and I had that righteous indignation, throw some booze down my throat, and I'd suddenly, I'd be the wittiest person, the sharpest tongued person. I'd defeat them in a row, and this is all going on in my head. They're not even present. So alcohol was a very creative juice, if you like, but it was so artificial. It's literally a toxin, and it's mad to be throwing it into your body. But I was truly mad that I believed my body needed it.
And so what would you say, or, looking back, like, what do you wish you would have known earlier?
That I'm okay, just as I am. So much of my life, I talk about this in my book at the end, and I'm realizing it so much. I've spent my whole life feeling less than or inferior to, and trying to hide that. So, I had this outward sort of hardness that you can't hurt me, but I also alienate you because of that hardness. And underneath all of that, I was just a very damaged, very insecure, very hurt little girl. And alcohol, that's the perfect conditions for alcohol. It fills that up and it makes you feel okay. And actually, I was okay to begin with. And alcohol took away what esteem and self-confidence I had. It stripped it bare. I didn't have great levels to begin with, but it took what little I could afford. It took more than I could afford to give. And today I'm not like that. Today I'm okay. I'm not, I'm just okay. And for the most part, I'm pretty relaxed and pretty chilled out.
Yeah,
yeah.
So beautiful. Just I'm okay to begin with.
And alcohol made me into a monster. There's no two ways about it. I was not a pleasant drunk. And I don't, now I'm in recovery, and I see drunk people all the time. It doesn't make anyone a pleasant drunk. But the most baffling thing about alcohol is we all think we're really sophisticated drunks. Do you know what I mean? And we weren't. Yeah, we were just as much as a twat as the next person. And so alcohol just lies and lies and lies and lies. And it's the perfect frenemy, isn't it, really?
Yeah, frenemy is a very good word for it. What do you see? What are your plans for the future?
Well, I'd love to know. I really don't know. I'm in a state of flux. I would love to. I'd love to go and walk from Canada to Mexico.
Oh, the other way.
Like childbirth. Yeah, madness as it is. As much as I hated it the first time around and I was in so much pain, it's like childbirth. You pop out one child, about 2 minutes later, you're like, oh, do you know what? I think I'll have child number 2 now. And it's like the brain is hardwired to forget pain, which is, I'm convinced, is one of the reasons I became an alcoholic. It's like I forgot all my hangovers within a few hours of them dissipating. I'd be like, oh, I can go and get drunk again now. So I just have a brain that forgets pain too. So part of me is very tempted to go and walk from Canada to Mexico via a different route. And part of me thinks, no, don't do that. Just settle down, grow up and be a responsible adult. So basically, I don't know is the short answer. But what I've learned about life is if I live too far in the future, I get quite scared in the present. So I tend to just take it each day as it comes and hope that somehow it'll all just unfold and it will all just get to the right destination in its own unique way. And I think that's what the trail taught me, was everything I worried about happened, but it didn't happen in the way I expected it to happen. And so I've learned, it's not going to happen this way and it's not going to happen that way. If I make too detailed plans, I'll end up disappointed. And if I don't take enough action, of course, I'll do nothing. So I genuinely don't know, but part of me is feeling very much watch this space, because it will be bonkers. I can't help myself.
Well, I'm very excited to see what you do next.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
Where can we find your book? So the book's called Everything You Ever Taught Me.
Yeah, by me, person Irresponsible, and it's available on Amazon and Kindle, so in paperback and ebook copy. Lots of people say, is it on audiobooks? But not yet. The cost of producing such a thing is quite prohibitive. So at the moment, it is just in paperback. But that means you can use it as a doorstop. But you can also use it on your Kindle too. So, use your Kindle as a doorstop. You'll probably break it. So I wouldn't advise that.
Well, I'm so grateful for you. Glad to hear your story and just see you living your life to its fullest. And it's so inspirational. I'm a fat female in my 40s. And so I'm like, God, I want to do something like that.
I can tell you now, you end up really skinny at the end of it, and that lasts about 2 months.
Okay.
Really fat again.
Oh, well, thank you.
So there's probably better ways.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, PI.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for having me. I've really loved it.
Attention, Idaho and California residents. If you're shopping for a mortgage, contact PacFi, a mortgage brokerage with the top wholesale lenders in the nation. They are committed to simplifying the mortgage process, saving you time and money. Call 858-442-7048 or visit pacfi.com. NMLS number 1462943, Equal Housing Lender. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Alcohol Tipping Point. I'm always here for you guys, so please feel free to reach out and talk to me on Instagram at Alcohol Tipping Point, and check out my website, alcoholtippingpoint.com. Again, I hope you can use these tips we talked about for the rest of your week. And until then, see you next time.